So for my, segment, this one's kind of dedicated to artists, musicians, and bands. I want to talk about how to kick someone out of the band. When it's time to dump them, what do you do? How do you go about it? So the way I'm going to treat this is very similar to when I have a new client come to my office, we sit down and the client says, "We have a band member. This person has become a problem for whatever reason," right? So some of the common themes seem to be someone has maybe a lot of drama that they bring into the band because it's like a family. You become very close, you love people, but at the end of the day, you have to treat it more like a business. And so if you have someone that's creating issues, at some point, you got to kind of move on. So we'll call it, there might be a cancer in the band and the cancer needs to go. So the first question that I always ask is, did this person help to write any of the music, right, that the band has distributed, performs, owns, so on and so forth? And the answer is going to be obviously yes or no. And then my follow up question, if that band member has contributed to the actual writing of the music, I'll say, all right, so do you have an agreement with that person as it relates to ownership of the music, as it relates to things like music earnings? And then so that's kind of step one. We determine what's all going on. Oftentimes, the band member has participated in some kind of way. So let's say if it was a guitar player, maybe the guitar player wrote some parts, played on an album, maybe didn't write any parts, but still played on the album, but contributed in some kind of way. So then we'll move on to the next step, which is determine the band name, meaning the trademark, who owns that, and what agreements are in place. So I'll ask, did this band member help to create the name? And do you guys have an agreement in writing as it relates to the ownership of the band's name? So then we determine yes or no. And, oftentimes there will be someone, there's usually one person in the band that kind of, originates the name. And I find that bands have a tendency not to put things like the band's name into a contract, right? Because you just kind of are spitballing ideas and someone might come up with the name, they'll be like, oh, that's great. And then they just run with it. But what they don't know is that if you don't have something in writing, that can create problems later on as to who owns the band's name. Okay, so step one, talk about ownership. Does this person potentially have any claim of ownership in the music because they helped to write it, they performed on the recordings? And then number two, talk about the band's name. Does this person have a claim in the name? And then in both scenarios, do you have anything in writing? Okay, so then what we talk about now as part of this first kind of phase is dealing with the problem and getting rid of the person, right? So I'm going to talk about where we land and how we resolve these, and then I'll talk about what you do to prevent problems in the first place, which is really what most bands should be doing. But this is the conversation I'm usually having them with them first, right? Which is, we already have a problem. What do we do? So in the instance that you, let's say, don't have a written agreement with the band member that you're trying to kick out, then you want to do something similar to a settlement agreement. Okay, so I might end up calling this something more like a band withdrawal or band removal or band member removal. But the heart of it is a settlement agreement. And it's saying, here's all the stuff, right, that band member may have a claim to as it relates to music, as it relates to trademarks. And then here's what's going to happen now that we're going our separate ways. And the reason why this is so important, guys, is because it has what's called a release of claims. You want to make sure that if you're kicking someone out of the band, that you're not just leaving yourself exposed to that person coming back later and bringing a claim for royalties, right? Earnings from the music, earnings from the music videos, maybe earnings from a tour. So, as far as getting everything on paper and figuring out how do we split this is the time to actually get something in writing. And what I say is that, sometimes it can be a little off-putting to kind of get, a contract from an attorney and then the band members getting an email. So let's say if it's from me. So they're getting an email from me and I'm like, you need to sign this contract. It can seem very scary and intimidating for that person. And they might be like, no, I don't want to sign anything. And, and then everything kind of can get worse from there. So what I say oftentimes to bands, I just go, look, see if you can figure out a way that everyone kind of amicably is going to walk away from this. Find your carrot, right? So you can have carrots, you can have sticks on how you handle these situations. Anytime you can kind of make this as nice as possible for the person who's exiting the band, as far as we're going to make sure that you still receive your share of the music that you helped to write, or There's going to be some kind of little lump sum paid to them. Anytime we can do that, that helps to kind of smooth things over. But in any case, you got to get something in writing. And then there has to be a release of claims so that everyone really does walk away and no one's going to be bringing claims against the other person later on. And this goes to the ex band member as well, right? So let's say, the band goes and does a show next week and obviously that band member's not in the band anymore, and they get into a fight and they break someone's jaw, and now the band is getting sued, and somehow that ex-band member is getting lopped into the lawsuit. So having a release of claims helps to protect the person exiting the band as well. So it plays both ways. I mean, we even talked about this on the show, right? We were talking about how Evanescence had kicked out their guitarist, Jen. So, as far as Evanescence put it, Evanescence is like, oh, we have loved our relationship with Jen. And they made it seem like it was kumbaya and very amicable as far as them, not kicking her out of the band. That's not the way they put it. But then Jen went and posted and she's like, I had no decision making in this. I didn't want to leave the band. So obviously they fired her. So things happen with small bands, with big bands, but the way you handle it is often the same. So in scenario number one, if you don't have stuff, the terms in a contract already with that band member, we got to do a settlement agreement. And then we got to figure out the best way for you guys to walk away and how that works with things like the music ownership, revenue coming in, and ownership of the band name. Now, if you were coming to my office for just a little 30-minute consultation and you were saying, what should we do to make sure bad stuff doesn't happen when we need to kick people out of the band later on? I would say you need to start an LLC. So it's a limited liability company. You add the members of the band to that company, and then you get an operating agreement. And an operating agreement is the contracts between all the members of the LLC. So it's the band member agreement. And so now you have something in place. If and when you need to kick someone out, you have a method, right? So it might be by majority vote, but you have a process for the removal of that band member. And then you also have the process and different, aspects in place to protect everyone involved, including the person who's kind of getting kicked out. Yeah, and I remember too, we were talking about Deftones, right? So they had kicked out their bassist Sergio because he had wanted a percentage of ownership, right? So we have all kinds of scenarios, and it's not always the band member is the problem and we need to kick this person out. I mean, sometimes we're trying to protect the band member who's been kicked out. And I actually had someone contact my office in recent weeks, and this was a similar kind of situation of just, someone who had invested a lot into the brand and there weren't any contracts. So it can kind of play both ways. But in any case, you always want to make sure you have your agreements in writing. So the best practice, start an LLC for the band. Very cheap, very simple. You can do it yourself, but obviously even a better practice is just to hire an attorney to do it for you. Start an LLC, get an operating agreement, everyone signs, and that's the cleanest way to run your operation.